Hello, this is Christian Idealism, and today I'm just gonna go over different varieties of naturalism and theism. I also want to point out that this will be an informal video, so I'm not gonna have any like real background stuff going on or any music. Just gonna kind of explain kind of the different forms of naturalism and theism that typically people talk about. So before I begin, I want to make a few points. So the first thing is I will not be going over a type of theism that requires supernaturalism. And the reason why is I think the distinction between natural and supernatural has no precise meaning. So it's very hard to actually define what you actually mean by natural and supernatural. People have different definitions, so I'm not even going to discuss it. And so my general assumption throughout this presentation will simply be that under all the views, whether you're a naturalist or a theist, that you accept some type of causal reality. So basically that there is only one ontological thing that grounds reality. Now, if you guys are familiar with my current video series, I talk about the foundation theory, and this is precisely what I'll be going over. Basically that there's only one foundation for reality, and again, regardless if you're a naturalist or a theist, this foundation has one ontological substance, and it's not really ontologically different than what we experience. So let's start off with, I'm going to start off with naturalism. So there are three types of naturalism, which I'll be going over. The first is what I call strict naturalism. The second is moderate naturalism. And the third is liberal naturalism. So to start off with what I call strict naturalism, this is simply the thesis that all that exists is physical things. So in short, under this type of naturalism, physicalism would be true. All that exists is physical causes and effects, and there are no abstract objects. So abstract objects is a little more complicated, but under this view, you basically say like all is physical and there are no like abstract objects. So in other words, there can't exist a reality outside of space and time. That space and time are really the only thing that really exists. In philosophy of mind, you can consider this view to be compatible with some type of non-reductive forms of physicalism. So it doesn't just require, reductionism. You could also be a non-reductionist and accept this type of naturalism. So a non-reductionist can say that the mind is physical in some way, but that the subjective qualities of experience are just kind of emergent phenomena. So this type of naturalism, or this form of naturalism, I would say that it would reject fundamental mentality. So it's very strict because it only accepts physical things, and that's pretty much all that really exists. Doesn't accept anything abstract. It doesn't accept anything that's not within anything that's not within space-time or somehow governed by space-time geometries. Doesn't exist. So that's what I call a strict naturalism. Now the next form of naturalism is what I like to call moderate naturalism. Now while this is similar to strict naturalism, it does accept things like abstract objects. So you could believe in things that are actually not physical at all in the strict sense. In fact, this view of naturalism is probably what a lot of naturalists nowadays are taking, because they realize that the nature of space-time is not fundamental, and so they need to expand the ontology of naturalism to include a non-spatial and non-temporal thing. So in other words, they have to accept things that are not necessarily confined by our space-time universe. However, even on this view, they would still reject fundamental mentality. So basically, they would say that while it's true that space and time are kind of not fundamental to reality, they would still accept some sort of non-mental foundation for reality. So in other words, they would still accept like some mindless foundation that grounds everything. So this is, again, it's a moderate naturalism, so it does accept something outside of physical space-time, but it doesn't grant something like fundamental mentality. It just says that the fundamental nature of reality, while it's true that the fundamental nature of reality is spaceless and timeless, or at least abstract in some sense, it does not accept that this foundation is mental in any way. So now we're going over to the third type of naturalism, which I call liberal naturalism. Now this view can actually be very, I would say, flexible. And there are a lot of views in this arena. So first, this view can accept fundamental mentality. So if you're a panpsychist or if you're a cosmopsychist, You can call yourself a naturalist while still holding to some sort of fundamental nature of consciousness. Furthermore, if you take like a very liberal form of naturalism, so if you want to go like really radical, you could hold to idealism. In fact, I would say that Bernardo Kastrup's idealism is a sort of type of liberal naturalism. So if you listen to his interviews and if you read his books, for example, he describes himself as a naturalist because while he does say that mentality is a natural process of the world, that this mentality kind of doesn't really have intentions, right? So he does accept like some sort of universal consciousness that grounds everything, but of course this universal consciousness isn't like it doesn't have really intentions, right? So that's why I like, it's a very liberal form of naturalism, but it is still naturalism, because again, it's not really a God per se with intentions. Rather, it's just you could say that the universal consciousness is just a natural phenomena that happens in nature. So again, that's Kastrup's view of idealism, and so yeah. Now I'm gonna go over to different types of theism. So in my mind, there are a few important boundaries I'd like to establish between naturalism and theism. One boundary between them, for example, might have to do with arbitrary limits. So most forms, not all forms, but most forms of naturalism would have to accept some type of arbitrary limit, whereas theism does not have to accept that. So now I want to point out that this isn't the only boundary, because of course there are some forms of naturalism that do have no arbitrary limits. But I would say another more important boundary would have to be intention. So basically, that the foundation for reality under naturalism would not have intentions, whereas under theism it would have intentions. So under Kastrup's version of idealism, for example, again, the universal consciousness that he postulates does not have the intention to create beings like us. However, on theism, you would have a God with intentions. So, again, there are three types of theism I'm going to go over. First, there is what I call deism. Second, there is classical theism. And then third, there is neoclassical theism. First, under deism, God would be the foundation for reality. However, this being, or whatever this God is, doesn't really care about humans or anyone else. So again, you're kind of left with like a morally neutral God. So again, this is deism. I would say like deism is probably more liberal because it's not compatible with any religion. So you don't have to be a Christian or a Muslim to accept it, right? Well, you can't accept it, right? But if you're not a Christian or a Muslim, you could actually accept some form of deism. So again, that's basically what it is, that God is the foundation for reality, that he kind of set things in motion, but that he kind of just stands back and doesn't really do anything. So that's deism. Now, the next type of theism is what's called classical theism. Now, under this view, God would not simply be a person or a being. Rather, he is what's called the ground for being itself. Now, this can be a little confusing because, in short, it simply means that God is just identical with existence. Under this view, there is a lot of acceptance of things, like, you have absolute divine simplicity, as well as other attributes like impassibility and immutability and so on. Another thing is that under this view, God does not have any psychological states. So when we say that like God is all loving, he wouldn't have the psychological state of love in that sort of way. It's kind of like this God is, it's really hard to understand the classical theistic version of God. You kind of have to use certain language to describe it. It's just, again, God is very abstract in that sense. Now, I want to point out here that classical theism has a lot of similar concepts with, it's actually very similar to liberal naturalism, because there's like so many similarities between them that it's really hard to like figure out if classical theism actually is a form of liberal naturalism. However, I want to point out here that, again, under classical theism, God would have some sort of intentions. And so because God would have intentions, I do not consider classical theism as a form of liberal naturalism, because God would have the intention to create the universe. So I just want to point that out. And then finally, the final type of theism was what I call neoclassical theism. Now, this is simply that the foundation for reality is God, or perfection, you want to call it. but that God also has emotions. He also has psychological states. So unlike classical theism, where God doesn't have psychological states or emotions, under neoclassical theism, God would have emotions and have some sort of psychological states. So again, God is a mind under neoclassical theism. So God can have a relationship with his creations, and also I want to point out here that God is also a person under neoclassical theism. I also want to point out again that this view would actually be compatible with certain forms of panentheism. So I would actually call myself a neoclassical theist because I'm a panentheist as well. But yeah. So basically, neoclassical theism, it would, I would say it's more strict, right? Because it's not naturalism, right? But you could accept at least the ontology. Like I accept Bernardo Kastrup's version of universal consciousness, but then I just add in a few things, like I added metacognition. I say that this universal consciousness has intentions, stuff like that. So again, it is very similar. Pretty much all forms of theism are similar to liberal forms of naturalism. So there's a lot of similarities. It's just there are a few differences, like again, intentionality. So under theism, you would have intentions to create the universe, whereas under naturalism, you wouldn't. So that's very brief, but that's basically the different variations of naturalism and theism. So thank you guys for watching. Thank you guys for listening. If you have any questions, let me know. And I might do this again sometime, kind of go into more detail, but I just kind of wanted to briefly go over these different forms. So thank you guys for watching, and have a nice day.